by that time, I'd been in the community 3 or 4 years. I was completely broken down. There was very little of myself left. I mean, sin was such a big deal. Like, we're so terrified. They load the language so that the language is used in such a way to control. So the word sin within our group would be a terrifying word. You've sinned and then you will be punished. One thing can be a sin one day and then another thing is a sin another day. And it's just so used to control and to sort of push you in different directions to the point where you just think you're going mad. And that's just the one word.
Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm thrilled to be here with psychotherapist and the founder of Hope Valley Counselling, Gillie Jenkinson. Gillie, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
We're going to be talking about a lot of interesting things today, among them cults. And I can't think of many things which capture the public imagination like a cult. You know, you see many fictional movies about them, documentaries. This is something you've lived. So
Yes.
You've had your own first-hand experience of what it's like to be part of a cult. And it sounds like, although you had a number of difficult experiences, you turned that into something really positive, and you made that into a huge part of your career at Hope Valley Counselling, where you help people who have been part of cults and help them to recover from that. I think it would be really useful and interesting for everyone to hear a little bit about your story. Reading your website, you say you were part of an abusive cult in the 1970s. Where does that story begin?
It really begins with somebody recruiting me, actually. I had no interest in religion. I wasn't really even seeking. In fact, I make a bit of a joke of this, but my main aim in life was to marry an English lord because that was kind of my background. And then somebody started to talk to me about God and Jesus. So this is a Christian Bible-based group that I ended up in. And I mean, I wasn't really that interested, but I did find some of what they were saying very moving. So it was sort of the emotional side started to sort of draw me in. And I wanted to go out. I was 18. I wanted to go out smoking, drinking. And I was kind of pressed into going to church. And I kind of capitulated. And I went from being, you know, a moderately normal teenager to becoming very fundamentalist in my thinking. I went from one person to another. I mean, my family saw a real change in me. And this was just moving into the sort of Christian church sphere. It wasn't a cult at that time, as I'll explain a cult. But unfortunately, because of my very radical mindset, I didn't have critical thinking. I didn't understand about red flags that, you know, you check out, how can you get out before you go in to anything. And I was naive. I'd been to boarding school. I grew up in Africa, actually, and I went to boarding school in England. I was quite probably institutionalized to some degree, but also not very worldly wise. So then became very much an activist within the churches that I was a part of. And unfortunately, that road led me down to joining this community because we had this vision for a radical alternative lifestyle. It was the 70s. You know, 70s was full of cults and communities and hippies and people setting up these kind of things. We weren't really hippies. We were the opposite. But
Yeah.
That's how I actually got into it at the beginning.
I feel like when people envision people who join a group like that, they often envision them as someone who has something missing, who feels like they're a bit lost or a bit wayward in some sense, or who have been traumatized. But that doesn't sound like your situation at all. It sounds like you were kind of a normal teenager that wanted the things that teenagers tend to want. And perhaps you said, you know, you're a bit naive and maybe lacked in critical thinking. But am I right in saying you don't fit that cliche that people often think about when they think about potential cult members?
Yeah, I mean, I had challenges throughout my life. I think everybody does. And I think the thing about the message was that God would love me forever, like it would always be good. And actually, unfortunately, maybe God was good, but unfortunately, some of the people that I met were not good at all. There is always going to be a vulnerability to why someone joins the cult and another person doesn't. But it was that kind of emotional piece of you'll never be abandoned. So it was just that very human thing of wanting that kind of continuity. And that was about Jesus and God. It wasn't about the people around me.
It wasn't interpersonal.
No, not really. Although, I mean, obviously, the person who really got me involved, you know, they were very personable and attractive. And there is what we call love bombing within this sort of field. And it wasn't to an extreme for me, but in some cases, there's this extreme of loving someone. We love you. And, you know, people don't love you when you first meet them. They just don't. But a lot of these groups and these settings are love bombing you and telling you we love you and we've got everything and it's going to be perfect. It's going to be wonderful. And then, unfortunately, it's not.
And I guess it might also be worth mentioning that even for normal adolescents, it is a time of looking for belonging, typically belonging outside of the family of origin, looking for a sense of identity. And I guess a group like that can provide both of those things, belonging and a sense of identity. And what you said earlier struck me, which to me sounded like a sense of unconditional love.
That's exactly right. It is promised within those settings, unconditional love. And being naive, I didn't think about it. I think about things now, but for some reason at that time, I took it at face value and I didn't pull it apart. And then later, maybe 2 or 3 years into this journey, before I joined the cult, I did start to question, actually. I lived with a vicar and his wife. He was a curate, actually, and then the vicar of the church. I remember going to see him and actually saying to him, really challenging him actually about, you know, you say you can see Jesus and God, but where do you see them? And unfortunately, he wasn't able to have a resilient and respectful conversation about that. And to help me to really think actually, well, what do I believe? You know, maybe I was doubting at that point. And unfortunately, that got lost and I never really made it through to actually thinking for myself. It kind of got suppressed again. So it was a kind of an arc, really, I think, of just accepting it and then thinking, actually, you know, what's all this about? And then having to go back into, actually, I've just got to accept it. I can't really debate it.
So how old would you have been around this time?
I think I was converted to Christianity at about 18. And then I was living in that world. And by the time I was 21, I moved from the south of England to the Midlands and I was an au pair. And then through living in this curate's family, I then needed counselling. So I went to what became the cult for counselling.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And what I discovered years later was they had half a day's training, which is probably why I'm really hot on therapists needing to get well trained, have a code of ethics, have supervision. It was a disaster for me that, you know, I had no idea. This was a deceitful recruitment, which you hear a lot about, because I didn't join a cult at the beginning. I actually joined a group that became a cult, which makes me slightly different. Because the churches weren't cults. I could go and see my family. I wasn't completely kind of taken over by it, really. But that then started to happen once I joined what became the community.
Right.
One of the first steps was that we started to live in community. So they had sort of households with people living, you could say shared housing. But a change happened, which was a theological way of looking at it, saying we're going to shift the gear on this living together. We're going to make this a radical Christianity. We were not living together and going to work. We are here with a mission. And that happened probably within months of me joining. And that process was already happening. I came into something that was already happening. And also I was so radicalized in myself, not just because of them, but because of the other groups and churches I'd been involved with, that I thought it was fantastic. And we shared all our money. We shared our clothes. We had a completely shared lifestyle. That did evolve, but, it sort of happened a little bit at a time, but that's where we ended up.
How were you initially recruited?
So there's a kind of two stages, because there's the step where I became a born-again Christian, which was I was pressed. And that's where, if I hadn't been held on to by this lovely woman, but she just sort of made sure that I was going to become a Christian, and I gave in. That was stage one. Stage two was then joining this fellowship, which then became the community. And that process was really because of my mental health. And I hit a crisis when I was an au pair in a different city. There were people who knew about this community who told me about it. I decided I either had a demon living in me, or I wasn't actually a Christian and I needed to become a Christian again. This is the type of Christianity I was exposed to. Actually, I was depressed. That's what I was the problem. But nobody around me had the ability to look clearly at that. And so I went then for this counselling, which did not help. But it did actually end up with me being recruited into the group, them sort of more or less saying, well, we can help you. And me just going and staying there with no understanding that this could really go wrong.
How did they counsel you? What kind of things did they tell you to try and presumably help you?
Well, it was a very specific type of counselling, Christian counselling, and I can't remember the name of it. But what they had been taught in their half days training was to draw a diagram of you. And so they'd tell you who you were. So kind of like giving you like your identity. At that time, I was quite buxom, you could say. Maybe a bit overweight. I don't know if I was particularly. And then I had this thing about wanting to be a lady. We were in quite a poor area of a Midlands city in the UK. I came from a very much more privileged background than they did. So I was a fish out of water. I'd been in Africa, boarding school, and suddenly I'm in this area of Birmingham. So I stood out as well. And they said that my identity was a fat lady, like a lady muck, And that was kind of what I needed to get rid of. Like in this setting, you can't retain your own sense of identity. You need to capitulate and become the person they think you should be, this godly person. And one clear way that changed is just in the clothes. Clothes are very important actually in how we present ourselves. And I used to wear I wasn't a hippie, but I loved wearing long clothes. And that was what you wore in the 70s. Most people did who were younger. And after I'd been in the community it was probably only a few months, I was sharing clothes with other people. And I went home wearing what now, look, I'm granny aged now, but what at that time I'd be thinking that's what a granny would wear, like a polyester dress that came up to my knees. So it was a sort of, not even a mini dress, which you'd expect it would be a mini or maxi, but not this kind of halfway polyester dress. And I went home in it and they're like, what's happened to her? And no makeup. And I used to wear lots of makeup and just a very marked change in me. and being really judgmental of other people, like, you need to join our church if you're going to be saved and you're going to hell. Honestly, I just took on the whole package. I was quite difficult to have around, I think.
It's really interesting that you use the word capitulate. So part of the recruitment is getting you to capitulate. And you also earlier used the phrase, I gave in. So there's something about surrendering. And of course, a lot more legitimate religions and philosophies, encourage some form of surrendering one's identity, like Buddhism springs to mind, where, to some extent you realize your identity is kind of a fiction and you might give it up for greater mental peace. But I suppose the key difference here is that you were being encouraged to give up your identity so that you could be more vulnerable to control, I suppose, and for exploitation. Do you think that's a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone intended that. I don't think they knew enough about it. It just seemed to evolve into it.
Another cliche you might hear about a cult is that there's like a charismatic leader at the center and they're kind of pulling the strings and setting the course that the group takes. Was that not the case in this situation?
That was the case, yes. There was a leader. And, when I look back, I think, but he certainly had a strong level of charisma. He was very gifted. He was a gifted singer, actually. And a lot of people gathered around him who appreciated this natural ability that he had, which he'd worked very hard on, really developed his singing. He was definitely the driving force behind the whole thing setting up, being a fellowship to then becoming a community. And then there was another leader who joined, who then actually became top dog, who really sort of crushed the founder. Let's call him the founder, the one who started it, who was the singer. And he took over, and it was him who was the sadist and who really took on board physical punishment and, extreme punishment for sin and that kind of thing. So, yeah, we had two leaders. There was the one, and then the other one came in. He'd been rejected by the Church of England to become a priest, very wisely on the Church of England's behalf. But unfortunately for us, he had the spare time and wanted to be a leader, and he came in and became full-time member of the community and really took control.
Yes, I'd like to get to that. But before that, what were the things you were encouraged to believe, and what were the things you were encouraged to do? What were the ideals that you were supposed to aspire to as a member of this community?
So it was evangelical Christianity, with, I don't know if you know about sort of evangelical charismatic Christianity. So you would say it was pretty mainstream in its beliefs, but we were isolated from the main church. We were a thing of our own. And so the interpretation of the Bible, or how other Christians might see things, can be twisted, and it was. I mean, sin was such a big deal, and it's sort of ridiculous when I look back. It's like, oh, you're all sinning, like we did nothing, like we're so terrified. So what they call loading the language, they load the language so that the language is used in such a way to control. So the word sin within our group would be a terrifying word. You've sinned, and then you will be punished. And it's really random. One thing can be a sin one day, and then another thing is a sin another day. And it's just so used to control and to sort of push you in different directions to the point where you just think you're going mad. And that's just the one word.
What were the kinds of things that were considered to be sinful, which perhaps outside of the group would be considered fairly normal?
So many things. I'll tell you this. This happened to me. It's a traumatic story I'm happy to tell you, but I think there needs to be a health warning to your listeners. So the founder was also the leader of my household, because in the end there were about 6 or 7 households. I can't remember exactly how many. And the leader of my household had arthritis in his hand, he said. And he stopped us all in the dining room and he said, "There's sin in the house. My hand is hurting." So his hand having arthritis only happened in his mind because of sin in the house. By that time, I'd been in the community 3 or 4 years. I was completely broken down. There was very little of myself left and what I would recognise as my identity. And I freaked out when he said it, and I confessed. And I said, it might be me. And he said, well, what is it? I said, I might be resentful. And then he said, you will need to be punished for that. And I was told to take off my top and my bra and to lean over this bench with all of the household sitting round. And I was physically beaten for that sin. Yeah.
Wow.
40 times with a cane. It was so painful. And I think I was almost becoming psychotic. I think he was probably psychotic, but they were telling me, you are looking down into hell if you don't repent. And I remember thinking, and there was some fight back in me of, I thought, I'm looking at the floor, I'm not looking at hell. But I couldn't get out of it. And then I broke down and I cried out to Jesus to help me. And they saw that then as my repentance. And then they took great care of me. I mean, my back was in pieces. And then I think this sort of trauma bonding occurred because then they were kind to me and I'd been such a bad person. I hadn't done anything. And then they punished me so much and then they were kind to me. And somehow that then had this effect of this trauma bonding of being even more, instead of walking out and going to the police, I was even more tied in with them.
Wow, how terrible. And it makes sense to me that they would give you this hugely negative, stressful, traumatic experience. And then by being kind to you, that lures you back in because they're just using, I mean, it's just frank emotional manipulation at that point. And you said that was from the founder who I believe you said was the less sadistic of the two leaders.
Yeah. But I think by this time, the new leader, I think he became the kind of victim perpetrator, you know, in terms of a structure within the group. I think the new leader took over and became top dog. And then he kind of manipulated the other one who wouldn't have done these things previously. He was annoying and he was somewhat controlling, but he wasn't like this.
And presumably these kinds of punishments were happening all the time to lots of people?
Yes. So a lot of people, and do you know, the leaders hardly ever did the punishment. They got other people to do it. So it wasn't this founder guy who actually beat me. He got somebody else to do it. So like, who do you pin it on? This other person was a victim of the system as well. I can't blame them. I don't blame them. I think everybody was in a mess. And I was beaten quite a number of other times. They would sort of hijack me and just say something, and somehow the answer to the question would be the wrong answer. So, well, you need to, you know, and it was such a terrifying time. It was terrifying. I had a look the other day at the house that we lived in, and it looks like just any house in England, a terraced house. And yet all of this was going on in there and nobody knew about it.
Often in these kinds of situations, people can be sexually exploited as well. What was the attitude in the group towards romantic or intimate relationships? How were things set up in that regard?
Well, the new leader, I think more than the founder, the new leader had sexual relationships with many people, but they would say, it's not sexual intercourse, so it's not really sex. So, you know, I'll do almost anything else. So there was like belly dancing going on, and honestly, things that Christians wouldn't do at all. Like it's a misnomer, really, that this was a Christian group. So I think there was a lot of sort of heavy petting going on and that sort of thing, which was very sexually abusive because these women didn't want this creep doing these things to them. In terms of marriage, well, quite often he split the married couples. So actually, some of the men were sharing beds. Oh, you weren't allowed to be gay. I mean, that was just nowhere near anything anybody could think about. And it was the 70s as well, but they had a very clear idea of what was allowed and what wasn't. And then suddenly it wasn't clear. It's very confusing to live in that setting. You feel like you're going crazy. So some of the men shared beds. Some of the married men shared a bed with other men, and their wives were segregated into a women's room for some reason. And I suppose I decided in the end it's kind of divide and rule, really, because a couple will talk, won't they?
They'll have a shared reality.
Yes, and they might actually disagree with what the leader's doing. So I kind of assumed in the end that's probably what was happening. Look, I met my husband in the group. He joined at the last 2 years, and we got married when the group disbanded, because I haven't said that, but in the 1981, the whole thing just fell apart, which is quite unusual. And then we got married. But I would hardly even dare think about anything about going out with him or anything like that, because I'd always probably end up confessing, which is one of the 8 components of thought reform, confession.
Right.
You give them ammunition, but you're so dissociated and confused that you don't realise you've told them. And so you think somehow God told them or something. So kind of having to really suppress so many thoughts and feelings all the time.
Was there any point before the group disbanded that you thought about leaving?
No. Isn't that weird? I mean, even now I think, wow. Because I work with so many people who've left cults, who had doubts, who, there's different ways of leaving a cult. And I think back, I was so terrified. It's hard to even articulate how terrified I was. Physical punishment will do that to you because it hurts. It really hurts. And so even when the punishment stopped, and it did stop because there was the danger the press were going to get hold of this information, and the leader decided to stop, and there's a whole story around that. But it's there. It's already there inside your body and your mind.
Yeah.
And it really is a journey to break free from that fear.
So it sounds like a lot of your life was encapsulated by fear. And I feel inclined to ask, and this is obviously not to justify in any way the actions of the people in the group or the leaders, but it's more so I get a comprehensive look at this. Were there any aspects in the day-to-day life of the cult that were like positive? Were there days you enjoyed? Were there days where you felt, oh, actually my quality of life was quite good here?
In the early days, yes. Before this second leader came in, and maybe even in the early days of him coming in, yeah, it was quite fun. I mean, we had friends. I just met up with one of the other ex-members about 2 months ago, and we were saying we were good friends. We were allies at the beginning. There was a freedom to come and go. All the meetings were held in our house. We didn't go to church. We did it all in our house. And sometimes we wouldn't go. We'd go and move the bedroom round, or we'd fiddle about and do something else. And I think friendships were there. We had some quite nice holidays, I think in the very early days. And then later we had these horrific holidays. So it kind of seemed to evolve over time. I mean, it's not a place I'd want to go back to, obviously, because of the abuse. But I suppose it was more like a shared household to start with.
And did you have to give up your work or any kind of studying as well?
Actually, when I left boarding school, I didn't have ambition, as I said. And my father suggested, I'm of a certain age and stuff, he suggested I went to a secretarial college, because that's what girls did. So I became a secretary, and I worked as a secretary just after I left school. And I was still training as a secretary when I became a Christian. So that was happening at the same time when I was 18. When I arrived in the cult, I had secretarial skills. And so initially I just did temp jobs, and all the money went into the cult. I missed all of my 20s of studying. I mean, I didn't think about studying at that point, but I do know that others who were recruited from the university actually stopped their studies to join the community. So I probably wouldn't have been allowed to study anyway. And then I stopped working for about 2 years and became house mother. I mean, I was 23, but I kind of kept house. Look, I didn't have the first idea how to keep house or how to cook. One of the things I was shown to cook was boiled sausages in white sauce. Sorry if I'm making anybody sick here. And apparently when my husband and I first got married and we left the cult, we used to have Brussels sprouts on toast.
Yes, the common British delicacy of Brussels sprouts on toast.
Exactly. Oh my goodness.
How did the group end up disbanding?
I think, as I said, there was a number of arcs in the level of control. And I think within the community, it was fairly free in the beginning. And then it really reached a fever pitch of the beatings and the sexual abuse and the levels of control, people not having contact with families being very concerned. And then it started to loosen up a bit. I don't really know why people started to think a bit more for themselves. Not me, really, because the other thing is that I was in number 6, which was treated as the lowest of the low households. The second leader who joined, his household was like the elite. So there was this kind of subtle hierarchy. And what happened is the women in the second leader's household started to question. And I think perhaps they started to talk between each other. I knew nothing about this. And then there was a very dramatic day where they thought this is not Christian behaviour. I mean, the other thing I haven't said, and I have said in other places, is that this second leader thought of James Bond as the ideal Christian man, which is absolutely ridiculous. But, you know, when you start putting all these pieces together, you have to say, this is not a Christian leader. This is a coercively controlling individual who's running a group.
Right.
And they started to realize and to wake up. This is a term often used in this field, is they started to wake up out of this kind of thrall of fear and abuse and rationalizing that this is somehow something to do with God. And they challenged him. I wasn't there, but they actually started to challenge him, this sexual abuse, this beatings that had stopped by that time. And he freaked out and apparently jumped out of the living room window and ran off to one of the other households to get them on his side. But that was the beginning of the end. It really did start to crumble from that point. I was just like, I have no idea really what was happening. I was so confused, so under it all. And Tony, my husband, we weren't married then. He realised very quickly that this leader was a charlatan and he changed sides. So the whole thing split into two and we had two sides. Tony was one side, I was the other. And then I went away to my mother's for a week. And this was very good for me because I tried to get my head working again and to think, oh, what's happening? And then I went back to the cult and confessed to Tony that I thought maybe I'd like to marry him. So he went off and thought about it and he decided, yes, actually, maybe I'd like to do that. It was a very unromantic way of getting together. But it was all happening at the same time. It was very traumatic as well, because the other thing is that we had to read out a commitment every day in a prayer time. So I commit myself to thee, my brethren, for now and eternity. And we'd all taken on this idea that we had to perpetuate the cult and to carry on the work of the cult, even if it fell apart. Well, that didn't happen. It really did fall apart. Tony and I left and we got married a few months later. We had nowhere to live, so we got married quite quickly. A break-off group with the founder went away for 2 or 3 years to another part of the city, and then that disbanded.
Did either of the leaders face any legal action after what happened?
No. And the fear was so high. Even 30 years later, people were terrified to meet them, but I did report them eventually.
Right.
The second leader that came in ended up training in a profession where they were working with vulnerable children and adults, and we reported them to their employers.
Mm. How psychologically destabilizing was it for you, for the group to disband and for you to figure out a new life with your husband?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the troubles was we moved from this hothouse of a cult into another church.
Mm.
So we didn't debunk or get to a place where we understood what had happened to us.
Right.
And the church we joined said they knew what a cult was, but they didn't. And so I went forward with my life in the same mindset, very fearful of authority, fearful of God, fearful of punishment, and being a very good girl.
So you hadn't really rediscovered your individuality, identity, autonomy, and so were being broken down as all those things were, vulnerable to then being exploited by this new church.
I mean, the new church wasn't a cult. They meant well. They thought they knew what a cult was, but the world's full of people who think they know what a cult is, and it's causing a lot of havoc for a lot of people.
Right.
Therapists, churches, and that sort of thing. So it took us another 14 years to actually go, okay, that's it. And that was when we joined a church locally to us, and they started to get really controlling. And then I thought, that was my crisis, actually, that the community disbanded. I probably wouldn't have left if it hadn't. I had nothing there in me saying, get out now. If you don't know what abuse is, and if you're told what we understand as abuse is actually something you deserve and is something God is doing to you, you have no way of finding your way to get out of it.
Mm.
There's no way of knowing, and we were told God wants to break you. Like, if God wants to break you, then why is this abuse? It's not abuse. God's breaking you.
And that goes to show how powerful belief is and how important it is to get your beliefs about the world and about reality in order, and how vulnerable you are if someone shapes your beliefs for you without any sort of critical thinking on your part.
Exactly. And that's a cult. I mean, there's some groups where, the leader sets out to do that. I don't think these people set out to do this, which is...
It's even more frightening in some sense.
Yes, how it just evolved into something. And, I've thought, well, what was my part in it? And I think my part in it was that I lost myself, and was that my fault? Like, I've been in boarding school. You have to respect the prefects and the people above you, and you must respect the teachers and be a good girl. I wasn't a Christian school, but I had that old-fashioned 70s kind of mentality. For women as well, of course, is a big deal.
What was the process like of you rediscovering yourself and your individuality and your autonomy?
So that's been a long journey, and I've worked with others on this. I think this is a key and core area. And I think that in order to be a member of such a group, we develop an introjected pseudo-identity. And I can say more about the introjects and the sort of Gestalt aspect to that. But I think within that setting, we are manipulated from above, and this is happening. But I think we do have a part in it. We have to, because how is it going to land in us? And I think it's through the process of introjection.
Mm.
And I think I introjected a kind of identity of myself as this, and it was already there to a degree, of being an obedient, good girl. I'm going to serve God. I'm going to do what I'm told, keep my head down, hide behind the chair if I have any emotions in the meeting, or they're going to come and tell me I'm in self-pity. Hide. But it's not a mask. It's a pseudo identity. And the clothes are part of that. The not wearing makeup, the hair, whatever is all part of that. And so it took the 14 years after 7 years in the church. Then we had some exit counselling. So we met with somebody who was not very ethical, who would fall asleep in the sessions, unfortunately, but who did understand about cults. And that started us on a process of beginning to understand what is it that we've been involved in, and what is it that I've been involved in, and actually just beginning to make sense of actually I became an introjected sort of person that is not me. Like, you wouldn't recognize me now to me then. And now I feel what I call my authentic identity. So I've used Gestalt theory with all the language through my thinking in my book, in what I talk about. And I use the Gestalt idea that identity is self and personality, and pulled on those ideas. So there's a consistent way of thinking throughout.
And obviously this is a continuous process, but how long do you think it took you after leaving the church to get to a point where you're a more authentic self, which you recognize?
Probably a few years. The first training I did was really important for me in terms of leaving and starting to get critical thinking. And I did a diploma in pastoral counselling at a theological college because I couldn't do secular training at that point. I knew I wanted to become a counsellor. There was nobody who understood this stuff when I left the church other than this unethical exit counsellor. There were no therapists at all. And so I set off on this road 35 years ago to train as a therapist and work with former members, which is what I've ended up doing. And this diploma in pastoral counselling was with Christians who were very different to many of the Christians I'd met, who were really expecting me to think critically, to think about what should I do. Were shocked when I thought I should pray with people. That's how you make people better. They're like, no, that's not what we're doing. They nearly fell off their chair when I said, we have to have 3-hour sessions of therapy. And they're like, no, you don't do that. No. So it was the beginning of that process.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Being such a rich story, I think we need a part 2. So after having heard that, I'd like to speak to you again. And in part 2, we'll discuss more about cults, from a theoretical standpoint, with some useful information people can be aware of, how we can define cults, how we can distinguish between cults and maybe other kinds of adjacent organizations, more about concepts like thought reform, or colloquially, as it's known, brainwashing, pathological spirituality. And I'd love to know more about your therapeutic process, how you work with people, and some practical concerns like legal concerns, how the NHS should or should not be involved. But for now, thank you so much for coming on and spending some time with me today.
You're very welcome.